The radar screen flickered once, then went completely dark. In the operations center of Forward Operating Base Sentinel, 23 miles from the Afghan-Pakistani border, the silence that followed was deafening. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stared at the blank monitor, his coffee growing cold in his trembling hand. 8 F-16 Fighting Falcons had vanished from radar contact simultaneously at 3:47 hours, their transponder signals disappearing as if someone had simply switched off a light. No mayday calls, no distress beacons, just emptiness where moments before, 8 American pilots had been flying routine patrol over the Khyber Pass. Colonel Marcus Henley burst through the door, his uniform hastily thrown over a white undershirt, boots unlaced. "Talk to me, Rodriguez. What happened to Viper Squadron?" The radar operator's voice cracked. "Sir, they were maintaining standard formation at Angels 25 then. Nothing. All 8 aircraft gone." Outside, the pre-dawn darkness of the Hindu Kush Mountains seemed to swallow the base whole. The only sound was the distant hum of generators and the whisper of wind across the tarmac where empty hangar bays gaped like missing teeth. Somewhere in those mountains, 8 pilots might be fighting for their lives, ejecting over hostile territory, or worse. The thought hung unspoken in the recycled air of the command center. Major Cassandra, Reaper, Volkov stood in the doorway, her flight suit pristine despite having been roused from her quarters. Her pale green eyes surveyed the chaos of the operations center with the cool assessment of someone who had seen worse nights than this. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a pilot who had logged over 3,000 combat hours across 2 theaters of war. The silver wings on her chest caught the harsh fluorescent light, but it was the small purple heart ribbon that most people noticed first, a souvenir from a surface-to-air missile over Syria that had killed her weapons systems officer and left her flying a crippled F-15E Strike Eagle home on one engine. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through the frantic chatter of radio operators and intelligence analysts, "I can find them." Colonel Henley turned, his face etched with the kind of exhaustion that comes from losing pilots under his command. "Reaper, we don't even know where they went down. The whole sector's gone black." Cassandra stepped closer to the radar display, her fingers tracing the last known positions of the missing aircraft. "I know that airspace better than anyone. I've flown night missions through those valleys for 18 months. If they're alive, they'll follow standard E&E protocols and head for the emergency rally points." The colonel's jaw tightened. Standard evasion and escape procedures meant the pilots would attempt to reach predetermined locations where rescue forces could extract them. But in the mountainous terrain of eastern Afghanistan, those rally points might as well have been on the moon. Captain Elena Vasquez materialized beside Cassandra, her dark eyes reflecting the same grim determination. As the squadron's intelligence officer, she had memorized every cave, every village, every goat path in their area of operations. "The weather's turning, sir. If we don't launch a search mission in the next 2 hours, we'll have zero visibility until tomorrow night." Standing there in the harsh light of the command center, with the weight of 8 missing pilots pressing down on everyone's shoulders, Cassandra felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always preceded a dangerous mission. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just risking her own life. She was asking to risk it for pilots who, until this moment, had barely acknowledged her existence. In a squadron where call signs like Maverick and Thunder dominated the ready room conversations, Reaper had always been an outsider, the pilot who had transferred in from Special Operations Command with a classified service record and a reputation for taking missions that other pilots wouldn't touch. "I can take a single aircraft," Cassandra continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "Low and fast, under the radar coverage. If I can establish radio contact with any of the survivors, we can coordinate a full-scale search and rescue operation." Colonel Henley studied her face, searching for any sign of the recklessness that had gotten so many pilots killed in these mountains. What he saw instead was the calm focus of a professional who understood exactly what she was volunteering for. But understanding and approving were two different things. The clock on the wall showed 3:52 hours. Time was running out, and with each passing minute, the chances of finding the missing pilots alive grew smaller. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the peaks, bringing with it the kind of weather that turned search and rescue operations into suicide missions. The radio crackled to life, startling everyone in the room. Through the static came a weak, intermittent signal, the automated emergency beacon from one of the missing F-16s. Rodriguez frantically adjusted his equipment, trying to triangulate the source, but the signal was too weak and broken to provide an accurate location. "It's coming from somewhere in the Spingar Range," he announced, his voice tight with concentration. "But I can't get a fix. The terrain's bouncing the signal all over the place." Cassandra moved to the large topographical map mounted on the wall, her finger tracing the jagged lines that represented some of the most dangerous flying territory in the world. The Spingar Mountains rose like broken teeth along the border, their peaks shrouded in clouds, and their valleys filled with the kind of crosswinds that could flip an aircraft upside down without warning. "There," she said, tapping a section of the map where three valleys converged. "If they went down in this area, they'd follow the river valley to the east. It's the only route that doesn't lead directly into Taliban territory." Captain Jake "Hotshot" Morrison, the squadron's youngest pilot, spoke up from across the room. "Reaper, that's a 50-mile search area in the worst weather conditions we've seen all month. Even if you find them, how are you going to get them out? One F-16 can't carry 8 pilots." The question hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Cassandra had been asking herself the same thing, running through scenarios and contingencies, calculating fuel loads and flight times. The mathematics of the situation were unforgiving. A single fighter aircraft simply couldn't mount an effective search and rescue operation across such a vast area. "I'm not going out there to bring them home," she said quietly. "I'm going out there to find them and guide the rescue birds to their location. But first, someone has to be willing to go into those mountains and establish contact." Colonel Henley walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where the silhouettes of remaining aircraft sat like sleeping predators in the pre-dawn darkness. The wind had picked up, sending clouds of dust across the tarmac and rattling the aluminum siding of the hangars. In a few hours, that wind would become a howling monster that would ground every aircraft on the base. Weather reports scrolled across computer screens, painting a picture of an approaching storm system that would bring high winds, zero visibility, and the kind of turbulence that could tear an aircraft apart. It was exactly the wrong time to launch a solo search mission into hostile territory, but it was also the only time they had. "Reaper," the colonel said without turning around, "what makes you think you can succeed where an entire squadron failed to even send a distress call?" The question struck at the heart of what everyone in the room was thinking but hadn't dared to voice. 8 experienced pilots, flying in perfect weather conditions, had simply vanished. What could one pilot accomplish that 8 had not? Cassandra's answer came without hesitation, delivered in the flat, emotionless tone that had earned her the respect of ground controllers from Baghdad to Kandahar. "Because I'm not going in there to fight. I'm going in there to listen." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady hum of communications equipment and the distant rumble of thunder. Everyone in the room understood the implications of what she had just said. While other pilots relied on radar, weapons systems, and electronic countermeasures, Cassandra had built her reputation on something far more fundamental: the ability to read the sky like a book, to hear the whispers of wind, and weather that warned of danger long before any instrument could detect it. Staff Sergeant Martinez, the squadron's senior enlisted advisor, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, With respect, you're talking about flying a single-seat fighter into a mountain range where we just lost 8 aircraft. Even if you find survivors, the extraction team won't be able to reach them until the weather clears. Then we hold them in place until extraction is possible, Cassandra replied. But first we have to find them, and that clock is ticking. She was right about the time pressure, and everyone knew it. Standard survival training taught pilots to find shelter and wait for rescue, but in the Hindu Kush, shelter was scarce, and Taliban patrols were constant. If the missing pilots were alive, they were probably moving, trying to reach the emergency rally points before enemy forces could locate them. Every hour that passed without contact reduced their chances of survival exponentially. Captain Morrison stepped forward, his boyish face creased with concern. "Reaper, I've flown with some of those guys for 2 years. If there was any way to help them, I'd be suiting up right now. But this isn't a mission, it's a death wish." The words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they reflected what Cassandra knew most of the squadron thought about her. To them, she was the outsider who had transferred in from the black world of special operations, the pilot who took unnecessary risks and somehow always managed to come home. They respected her skills, but they didn't trust her judgment, and they certainly didn't understand the drive that compelled her to volunteer for missions that others considered impossible. What they didn't know, what she had never told anyone, was that she had been in the same situation as those missing pilots once before. 3 years ago, over the skis of Syria, she had found herself alone and running out of fuel, with enemy fighters closing in and no hope of rescue. The pilot who had saved her life that night had been called Maverick by his squadron mates, but his real name was David Chen, and he had died 6 months later in a training accident that should never have happened. The memory of David's voice crackling through her headset, calm, professional, guiding her home through a maze of surface-to-air missiles and enemy interceptors, was what drove her to volunteer for search and rescue missions that other pilots wouldn't touch. It was what made her study terrain maps until she could navigate by memory, and what kept her awake at night studying weather patterns and enemy patrol routes. "Colonel," she said, her voice carrying a note of urgency that made everyone in the room pay attention, "those pilots are following the same survival protocols I would follow. They're moving toward the rally points, but they're doing it at night to avoid detection. If I can intercept their route before dawn, I can establish radio contact and coordinate with the rescue teams." Colonel Henley turned away from the window, his face showing the weight of command decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for American pilots. At 54, he had commanded fighter squadrons in 3 different theaters of war, and he had learned to recognize the difference between courage and recklessness. What he saw in Cassandra's eyes was something else entirely: the quiet confidence of a pilot who had calculated the risks and accepted them as part of the job. "The weather reports show sustained winds of 40 knots with gusts up to 60, he said. "Visibility dropping to 0 in the next 3 hours. Even if you make it to the search area, you won't be able to see anything." "Sir, I don't need to see them," Cassandra replied. "I need to hear them. Emergency radios have a range of about 20 miles in clear conditions. In the mountains, that drops to maybe 5 miles, but it's enough. If I can get close to their probable location, I can establish contact." The plan was simple in concept but terrifyingly complex in execution. She would take off alone, flying low to avoid radar detection, and navigate through the treacherous mountain passes using only her instruments and memory. Once in the search area, she would orbit at the lowest safe altitude, listening for emergency beacon signals or radio transmissions from the missing pilots. If she made contact, she would coordinate their positions with the rescue teams and guide them to safety. The margin for error was essentially zero. A single mistake, a momentary loss of spatial orientation, an unexpected downdraft, a navigation error of just a few degrees would mean flying directly into a mountainside at 400 miles per hour. But for 8 American pilots who might be fighting for their lives in hostile territory, it was a risk worth taking. Captain Vasquez approached the mission planning table, spreading out detailed photographs of the search area. "Reaper, if you're serious about this, we need to talk about ingress and egress routes. The radar coverage has gaps, but they're small and they move with the weather." Together, they began plotting a flight path that would take Cassandra through the valleys and mountain passes with the lowest probability of detection. It was a serpentine route that would add 40 minutes to her flight time and require her to navigate through terrain that was challenging even in perfect weather conditions. But it was also the only way to reach the search area without alerting every Taliban fighter and surface-to-air missile battery within 100 miles. "The fuel calculations are tight," Vasquez continued, running her finger along the proposed route. "You'll have maybe 30 minutes of search time before you have to turn back. That's not much margin for finding 8 pilots scattered across 50 square miles of mountain terrain." Cassandra nodded, already running through fuel consumption rates and contingency planning in her head. 30 minutes wasn't much time, but it was enough to cover the most likely survivor locations and establish radio contact if the missing pilots were following standard evasion procedures. The key would be efficient search patterns and a little bit of luck, two things that had kept her alive through more dangerous missions than she cared to remember. The radio squawked again, this time carrying a different signal, the unmistakable sound of an emergency locator beacon, weak and intermittent but definitely there. Rodriguez hunched over his equipment, fine-tuning the receiver and trying to extract every bit of information from the fragmented transmission. "I'm getting multiple signals now," he announced, his voice tight with concentration. "At least 3 different beacons, all in the same general area. They're alive, sir. At least some of them are alive." The news electrified everyone in the room. 3 emergency beacons meant 3 pilots who had successfully ejected from their aircraft and activated their survival equipment. It also meant that somewhere in the darkness of the Hindu Kush Mountains, American airmen were waiting for rescue that might never come unless someone was willing to risk everything to find them. Colonel Henley looked at the weather reports one more time, then at the mission planning materials spread across the table. The mathematics of the situation were brutal: high probability of aircraft loss, minimal chance of successful rescue, and weather conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. By every rational measure, it was a mission that should not be approved. But rationality had its limits when American lives were at stake. In the end, command decisions came down to something far more fundamental than risk assessments and probability calculations. They came down to the simple question of whether you were willing to leave your people behind. "Reaper," he said quietly, "get suited up. You launch in 20 minutes." The words seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet operations center. After all the planning and discussion, the moment of commitment had arrived with startling abruptness. In 20 minutes, Cassandra would climb into the cockpit of an F-16 Fighting Falcon and disappear into the same darkness that had swallowed 8 of her fellow pilots just hours earlier. As she turned to leave, Captain Morrison called out, "Reaper, wait." His voice carried a note of something that might have been respect or possibly fear. "Good hunting out there. Bring them home." She paused at the doorway, looking back at the faces of men and women who had finally stopped seeing her as an outsider and started seeing her as their last hope for bringing 8 missing pilots home alive. The weight of their expectations was almost as heavy as the responsibility she was about to shoulder, but it was a familiar weight, one she had carried before and would carry again if necessary. "I'll find them," she said simply, and then she was gone, leaving behind only the soft whisper of her flight boots on the concrete floor and the lingering scent of jet fuel that seemed to follow fighter pilots wherever they went. Outside, the first drops of rain were beginning to fall, and the wind was picking up strength as the storm system moved in from the northwest. In the distance, lightning flickered among the peaks of the Hindu Kush, illuminating the jagged ridgelines for brief moments before plunging them back into darkness. It was going to be a long night for everyone involved, but especially for one pilot who was about to fly alone into some of the most dangerous airspace in the world, guided only by her skill, her instincts, and an unshakable determination to bring her fellow aviators home. The maintenance crew was already pre-flighting her aircraft when she reached the flight line, their flashlights dancing across the sleek gray fuselage of the F-16 like fireflies in the darkness. Chief Master Sergeant Williams looked up from his checklist as she approached, his weathered face creased with concern. "She's ready to fly, ma'am," he said, patting the aircraft's nose with the affection of a man who had spent 30 years keeping fighters in the air. "Full fuel load, standard air-to-air configuration. I took the liberty of adding an extra survival kit behind your seat, water, rations, medical supplies, just in case." Cassandra nodded her thanks, understanding the unspoken message. In case she went down in the same mountains that had already claimed 8 aircraft, she would need every advantage she could get to survive until rescue arrived. The extra weight would reduce her fuel efficiency and maneuverability, but it was a trade-off worth making. She began her pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision that had been drilled into her during flight training more than a decade earlier. Every rivet, every control surface, every warning light received her careful attention. In the harsh world of military aviation, attention to detail was the difference between coming home and becoming another casualty statistic. Tonight, with weather conditions deteriorating and 8 lives hanging in the balance, that attention to detail would be more important than ever. The cockpit of the F-16 was a familiar sanctuary, its instruments and controls arranged with the logical precision of a machine designed for one purpose: controlled violence delivered with surgical accuracy. But tonight, those same systems would be used for something very different. Instead of seeking targets to destroy, she would be searching for voices in the darkness, trying to establish contact with pilots who might be injured, scared, and running out of time. As she strapped into the ejection seat and began the engine start sequence, Cassandra allowed herself one moment to consider the magnitude of what she was attempting. 8 experienced pilots had vanished without a trace in conditions far better than what she was about to face. The logical part of her mind cataloged all the ways this mission could go wrong: mechanical failure, weather, enemy action, or simple pilot error in challenging conditions. But logic had its place, and this wasn't it. Somewhere in the mountains ahead, American pilots were waiting for rescue that would only come if someone was willing to risk everything to find them. It was a risk she had accepted the day she pinned on her wings, and it was a risk she would accept again tonight. The F-16's engine wound up to full power with a sound like controlled thunder, and Cassandra felt the familiar vibration that meant her aircraft was ready to fly. In the darkness around her, ground crew members gave her thumbs-up signals and pulled away the external power carts and safety equipment that had kept her aircraft tethered to the earth. Sentinel Tower, Reaper 1, requesting taxi clearance for immediate departure. Reaper 1, Sentinel Tower, you are cleared to taxi runway 09. Winds currently 340 at 28 knots, gusting to 42. Visibility dropping rapidly. Are you sure about this, ma'am? The tower controller's voice carried a note of concern that was unusual for routine communications. Everyone on the base knew about the missing squadron, and everyone understood that this was not a routine mission. This was one pilot flying alone into conditions that had already claimed 8 aircraft, guided only by hope and determination. Sentinel Tower, Reaper 1 is mission ready, requesting immediate takeoff clearance. There was a pause, filled with the crackle of static and the distant rumble of thunder. Then, Reaper 1, you are cleared for takeoff runway 09. Good luck out there and Godspeed. The words followed her as she advanced the throttles and felt 20,000 pounds of thrust push her aircraft down the runway and into the storm-darkened sky. Below, the lights of forward operating base Sentinel disappeared into the darkness, leaving her alone with her instruments and the daunting task of finding 8 needles in a haystack that covered thousands of square miles of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. But as the F-16 climbed into the turbulent air above the Hindu Kush Mountains, Cassandra felt the familiar calm that always settled over her when the mission began in earnest. The planning was done, the risks were accepted, and now there was only the pure, focused challenge of flying and fighting and bringing everyone home alive. It was what she had been trained for, what she lived for, and what she was willing to die for if necessary. In the operations center far below, Colonel Henley watched the single radar contact that represented their last hope for finding the missing squadron. The blip moved steadily northwest, following the planned route through the mountain passes with the steady precision of a pilot who knew exactly where she was going and why. "Sir," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called out, "I'm getting stronger beacon signals now. Definitely multiple survivors all in the same general area, if Reaper can reach them." "She'll reach them," the colonel said with more confidence than he felt. "She always does." But even as he spoke, he knew that this time was different. This time, Major Cassandra Volkov wasn't just risking her own life on a dangerous mission. She was carrying the hopes and prayers of everyone who had ever worn the uniform, everyone who understood that the most sacred promise made by military leaders was simple and absolute: we leave no one behind. In the darkness above the mountains, guided only by instruments and instinct, one pilot flew alone toward a rendezvous with destiny that would either bring 8 American airmen home alive or add her name to the growing list of those who had given everything in service to that promise. The storm was getting worse, the mountains were getting higher, and time was running out. But Major Cassandra, Reaper, Volkov had never backed down from impossible odds before, and she wasn't about to start tonight. The first indication that something was wrong came 15 minutes into the flight, when her radar warning receiver began chirping with the distinctive tone that meant enemy radar was painting her aircraft. Cassandra immediately descended to a lower altitude, using the terrain to mask her approach, but the warning continued intermittently as she navigated through the mountain passes. Taliban forces in the region had learned to position mobile radar units in the high passes, creating overlapping coverage that was difficult to avoid and impossible to predict. The radars themselves were relatively primitive, but they were effective enough to vector surface-to-air missiles or fighter aircraft toward intruding American aircraft. Tonight, with visibility near zero and communications limited, those radar sites represented a threat that could end her mission before it even began. Reaper 1, Sentinel Control, we're showing intermittent radar contacts in your area. Recommend you climb to avoid terrain. The voice of the air traffic controller crackled through her headset, distorted by static and the increasing electrical activity of the storm. Climbing would reduce the terrain threat, but increase her visibility to enemy radar systems, a classic catch-22 that had claimed the lives of too many pilots in these mountains. Sentinel Control, Reaper 1 maintaining current altitude. I have the terrain. It was pilot shorthand for, I know where I am and I can see well enough to avoid flying into a mountain. But in current conditions, it was more hope than certainty. The night vision system in her helmet was struggling to penetrate the clouds and precipitation, and her radar was being degraded by ground clutter and weather returns. Navigation was becoming an exercise in dead reckoning and educated guesswork, relying on compass headings and elapsed time to maintain course toward the search area. The GPS system was functioning, but its accuracy was being degraded by atmospheric conditions and the proximity of the mountains, which created multipath errors that could put her position off by several miles. 25 minutes into the flight, she reached the first waypoint on her planned route, a distinctive ridgeline that should have been visible even in poor weather conditions. But when she looked out of the cockpit, she saw nothing but impenetrable darkness broken occasionally by flashes of lightning that illuminated the clouds from within. For a moment, doubt crept into her mind. The logical part of her brain whispered that this was exactly how pilots got killed in these mountains, pressing on into deteriorating conditions, losing situational awareness, and flying into terrain that they never saw coming. The smart thing to do would be to turn around, return to base, and wait for better weather. But logic was a luxury she couldn't afford tonight. Somewhere in the darkness below, 8 American pilots were waiting for rescue that might never come if she turned back now. They were counting on her to find them, to establish contact, and to guide rescue forces to their location. It was a responsibility that weighed heavier than the aircraft she was flying. The emergency beacon signals were getting stronger now, crackling through her radio receiver with increasing clarity as she approached the search area. She could make out at least 4 distinct transmissions, which meant that more pilots had survived than they had initially hoped. The beacons were coming from a valley system about 15 miles ahead, in terrain that was challenging to navigate even in perfect weather. Reaper 1, any station, this is Viper 7. Do you copy? The voice cut through the static like a knife, clear and professional despite the obvious stress behind it. Cassandra immediately responded, her own voice steady and reassuring. Viper 7, Reaper 1. I copy you loud and clear. What's your status? Reaper 1, Viper 7. We have 8 souls on the ground, 4 walking wounded, 1 critical. We're approximately 12 miles northeast of Rally Point Alpha, moving toward the river valley. Can you provide extraction coordination? The relief in the pilot's voice was palpable, but it was tempered by the reality of their situation. 8 pilots on the ground in hostile territory, with at least 1 critically injured and weather conditions that would prevent any rescue attempt until the storm passed. But they were alive, they were organized, and they had established contact with friendly forces. Viper 7, Reaper 1 copies 8 souls, 4 wounded, 1 critical. I'm going to orbit your area and coordinate with rescue forces. Can you provide more specific location information? Reaper 1, we're following the main river valley northeast. We can see lightning strikes on the ridgelines to our west. We have strobes and can activate them on your command. Cassandra quickly plotted their probable location on her map, cross-referencing the terrain features with the emergency beacon signals she was receiving. The pilots were approximately 8 miles from her current position, moving through terrain that would provide good concealment from enemy forces, but would also make rescue extremely difficult. Viper 7, do not activate strobes at this time. I'm going to make a low pass through your area and try to establish visual contact. Continue moving northeast and maintain radio discipline. She banked the F-16 into a descending turn, following the contours of the valley system toward the survivor's reported position. The radar altimeter showed her flying barely 300 feet above the valley floor, close enough to the terrain that a momentary distraction could be fatal. Through the darkness and storm, she caught a glimpse of something that didn't belong, a brief flash of orange light that disappeared almost immediately. It could have been lightning reflecting off water, or it could have been the emergency strobe from a survival kit. She circled back for another look, flying even lower this time. Viper 7, Reaper 1. I think I have visual contact with your position. I see what looks like a strobe light in the river valley, approximately 2 miles north of the bridge. Can you confirm? Negative, Reaper 1. We don't have any strobes activated. Whatever you're seeing, it's not us. The words sent a chill down Cassandra's spine. If the light she had seen wasn't from the American pilots, then it was from someone else, most likely Taliban forces conducting their own search operation. Enemy fighters who were looking for the same downed pilots she was trying to rescue. Viper 7, be advised you may have hostile forces in your area. Recommend you find concealment and hold position until I can coordinate close air support. Reaper 1, understood. We're moving to higher ground and will attempt to avoid contact. How long until rescue forces arrive? It was the question she had been dreading, because the answer was not what anyone wanted to hear. Weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly, and the storm system was expected to last for at least 12 hours. Even if rescue helicopters could launch immediately, they wouldn't be able to reach the survivors until the weather cleared. Viper 7, rescue forces are on standby, but weather is preventing launch at this time. Estimate 12 to 18 hours before extraction is possible. Can you maintain your position that long? The silence that followed was filled with the implications of what she had just told them. 18 hours on the ground in hostile territory, with limited supplies and at least one critically injured pilot. It was a survival situation that would test the limits of their training and endurance. Reaper 1, Viper 7. We'll make it work. Request you coordinate medical supply drop if possible. Our wounded need immediate attention. Medical supplies dropped from an F-16. In current weather conditions would be scattered across miles of mountain terrain, and the chances of the survivors finding them were minimal. But it was the only option they had, and any chance was better than no chance at all. Viper 7, I'll coordinate with base operations and see what we can arrange. In the meantime, maintain radio discipline and avoid contact with hostile forces. I'll remain on station as long as fuel permits. As she continued to orbit the area, Cassandra found herself thinking about the 8 pilots scattered across the valley below. Some of them she knew well. Captain Williams had been her wingman on several missions, and Lieutenant Commander Hayes had taught her the finer points of night navigation when she first arrived at the squadron. Others were newer arrivals who she had barely spoken to, but who were now depending on her to coordinate their rescue. The fuel gauge was showing the inevitable progression toward the point where she would have to return to base or risk running out of fuel over the mountains. She had maybe 15 minutes of station time left before she would have to start the long flight home, leaving the survivors alone in the darkness with enemy forces somewhere nearby. But 15 minutes could be enough to make a difference. 15 minutes could mean the difference between a successful rescue operation and 8 more names on the casualty lists. She adjusted her orbit pattern to provide better coverage of the area where the survivors were moving, and settled in for the most important quarter hour of her military career. Reaper 1, this is Viper 4. We have movement to our south approximately 1 mile. Looks like a patrol with vehicles. Request immediate air support. The transmission crackled with urgency, and Cassandra immediately adjusted her position to get a better view of the southern approach to the survivors' location. Through her night vision system, she could make out the distinctive heat signatures of vehicles moving through the valley, at least 3 trucks carrying what appeared to be armed personnel. Viper 4, Reaper 1 has visual on the patrol. Count 3 vehicles with approximately 20 personnel. They appear to be conducting a search pattern. Can you avoid contact? Negative, Reaper 1. We have 1 critical casualty who can't be moved quickly. If they maintain their current heading, they'll be on top of us in 10 minutes. The situation had just become exponentially more complicated. Taliban forces were closing in on the survivors' position, and there was no way to extract the American pilots before contact became inevitable. The only option was to drive off or destroy the enemy patrol, but that would require weapons that her aircraft wasn't carrying and authorization that might not come in time. Viper 4, I'm going to make a low pass over the patrol and see if I can discourage them from continuing their search. Stand by. She rolled the F-16 into a steep dive, descending toward the valley floor at nearly 500 miles per hour. The plan was simple: fly low and fast over the enemy patrol, using the sonic boom and engine noise to convince them that they were about to be attacked by American aircraft. It was a bluff, but it might be enough to make them reconsider their search operation. The trucks were clearly visible now, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they moved along what appeared to be a dirt road. She could see personnel dismounted and moving on foot, spreading out in a search pattern that would inevitably lead them to the American survivors. At 500 feet above ground level, she pulled the F-16 into a climb, the afterburner lighting up the sky like a meteor as she accelerated away from the target area. The sonic boom that followed would be heard for miles in every direction, a clear announcement that American air power was present and watching. Viper 4, Reaper 1. The patrol has stopped moving and appears to be regrouping. You may have bought yourself some time, but I don't think they're going to withdraw completely. Reaper 1, copy. We're moving to a more defensible position on the ridgeline. How much longer can you stay on station? The fuel gauge provided the answer before she could respond. 5 minutes of station time left, maybe less if she had to make any more high-speed passes. After that, she would have to return to base, leaving the survivors alone with an enemy patrol that was actively searching for them. Viper 4, I have about 5 minutes before I have to head home. I'm going to try to establish contact with rescue coordination and see if we can get some immediate support out here. Reaper 1, copy. Thanks for everything you've done. We'll hold position and wait for extraction. The professionalism in the pilot's voice was remarkable considering the circumstances. Shot down in hostile territory, being hunted by enemy forces, with one critically injured comrade and no immediate prospect for rescue, and still maintaining military bearing and calm radio discipline. It was the kind of performance that reminded her why she had volunteered for this mission in the first place. She switched radio frequencies to contact the Rescue Coordination Center, hoping that someone had managed to launch a search and rescue mission despite the weather conditions. What she heard instead was a series of status updates that painted a grim picture of the resources available for immediate response. Rescue Control, Reaper 1. I have contact with 8 survivors in the Spin Gar Valley system. They have enemy forces in their immediate.